Ocean waters hold many undiscovered secrets, including the fate of those lost at sea. Off the island of Maui, Hawaii, 5 men set out for a day of fishing, but never returned after a storm overwhelmed the island. But were the men lost to the dark depths of the water, or did they suffer a different fate? Today on Dark Matters, the case that launched one of the largest ocean searches in the history of the Hawaiian Islands, the vanished crew of the Sarah Joe. The morning of February 11th, 1979 was picture perfect, cloudless skies for miles and the blue ocean waters of the Hana Bay. A group of 5 friends who jokingly called themselves the Nahiku Gorillas decided this wasn't a day for working, but a day for fishing. The group consisted of Patrick Woessner, a 26-year-old carpenter, and Peter Hanchett, a 31-year-old plumber. Then there was Benjamin Kalama, the eldest in the group at age 38, who worked as a construction tile setter in order to support his 5 children and wife. Rounding out the group was 2 27-year-olds, Ralph Malaiakini, who owned his own trucking company, and Scott Moorman, a carpenter. Scott came to Hawaii in 1975, leaving behind a wife and child to pursue his lifelong dream of settling in the islands. The grown men abandoned their work with the excitement of children, declaring a day off in favor of fishing out on the waters. Ralph borrowed his twin brother's 17-foot Boston whaler named Sarah Joe, and the men loaded into the skiff with beer, fishing rods, a cooler of ice, and plenty of food to keep the hunger at bay. They set off from the docks around 10 a.m., and by 1 p.m. they were far away from the coast. The men had no way of knowing they were about to be struck by one of the most severe storms to hit Maui in 50 years. Even if they did notice the darkening skies or the changing winds, they were too far to outrun the storm to shore. Ralph's wife and twin brother were alarmed at the sight of 40-foot tall swells breaching the shores and alerted the Coast Guard of the Sarah Joe situation. Peter Hanchett's father, John Hanchett, along with family friend and marine biologist John Naughton, set out to try and find the men and searched for the skiff in vain. John said, "We went out of Hana Harbor about a half mile and then down the coast, and I still didn't see any sign of the boys. The oceans were fierce. I've never seen it get that rough." The gale-like winds, massive waves, and torrential rain made searching nearly impossible, and relatives were forced to wait on shore and hope the men could hold their own until the weather passed. By the morning of February 12th, the men still hadn't returned. Family and friends grew increasingly concerned that the whaler had overturned out in the ocean, and that's when the U.S. Coast Guard joined the search efforts. In total, 44 planes and 330 hours of flying time were logged, and the combined efforts of volunteer searchers and the Coast Guard covered a 73,000 square mile area. However, after 5 days without a trace of the Sarah Joe, the Coast Guard ended their search, and while it was a hard truth to face, it wasn't surprising. The men were lost in the Alanuihaha Channel, some of the roughest waters around the islands, and had been battered by a powerful storm. Someone reported they'd heard a distress call for engine trouble over the Citizens Band radio, believing the message to be from the Sarah Joe. However, according to John Hanchett, the men weren't in possession of a radio when they left shore. Still, volunteer searchers refused to give up, and they raised over $50,000 and scoured the beaches, but found nothing but sand. Eventually, the search ceased altogether, but the people never stopped thinking about the Sarah Joe. Hope for any answers of what happened to Peter, Patrick, Benjamin, Ralph, and Scott seemed just as lost as the 5 men. But 10 years later, one answer emerged from the sea. But with its discovery, hundreds of new questions were born. On September 8, 1988, John Naughton, the same man who had aided Mr. Hanchett's initial search the day of the storm, was on a government-funded wildlife excursion scouting the Marshall Islands for potential wildlife sanctuary areas. The 5 disappeared men were far from his mind and from his expedition. He was 2,000 miles west of Maui. Then he saw an abandoned skiff on the shore of a deserted atoll, or a ring-shaped island composed of coral. Stopping at the island, John got a closer look at the boat and felt a pang of recognition. He said, quote, "On the boat, there were still a few letters and numbers from the registration number, and immediately I saw that it started with an HA, which indicates that the boat was registered in the Hawaiian Islands. But even more alarming was what lay 60 yards away from the boat, in a pile of stones, with a makeshift wooden cross, resembling a grave marker. What John saw then confirmed it. He said, quote, "When we got up there, we could immediately see that there was a human jawbone protruding out of the pile of rocks." Later, John received confirmation that the boat was, in fact, the missing Sarah Jo. And almost as if it had been left there for easy identification, the teeth within the jawbone matched the dental records of one of the missing men, Scott Moorman. When the grave was excavated, the rest of Scott's bones were found inside, along with a peculiar, small binding of paper. Captain Jim Cushman of the U.S. Coast Guard described it as follows. It was a sheaf of paper, and I'd say a book, except it was not bound, probably about 3 inches by maybe 3/4 of an inch thick. Between each one of the pieces of paper was a very small square piece of foil material. We have not been able to determine who placed that there or what purpose it serves. The paper did not appear to be a journal or logbook, as it was absent of any writing. But the mystery only deepens and twists in its strangeness. There was no trace of the other 4 missing men anywhere on the island. Judging by ocean currents, the Sarah Jo would have made land on the Marshall Islands just 3 months after the storm in February of 1979, but this particular atoll, called Taongi, was surveyed by the U.S. government 6 years after the men disappeared. At the time of the survey, the boat should have already been on shore, but there was no mention of the Sarah Jo in the government's report. So, how did the whaler and only one of its crew members make it 2,000 miles away a decade after it went missing? What happened to the other crew members? For that matter, what happened to Scott, and who buried him? Since many of the ocean's secrets anchor to the seabed, we're left with our own speculations. So let's start with the Sarah Jo itself. If the path and timeline of the Sarah Jo was accurate, where was the boat during the survey? Forum users point out that it's possible the surveyors were unaware of the boat's disappearance. User Neko writes that the surveyor could have, quote, simply thought that the whaler had broken loose from a dock or mooring during a storm. Whalers have fairly low profiles, and perhaps it had been less visible at the time of the survey due to shifting sand or debris. I don't know much about government land surveys or how thoroughly the land is documented, but I think it's entirely possible that the boat was simply overlooked. However, I'm guessing a shallow grave wouldn't have been as easy to ignore since it was marked with a cross and a jawbone. So let's look at Scott's burial. 3 big questions we have here are as follows. Number 1. What fate did Scott meet? Perhaps the remains were too far deteriorated to determine an exact cause of death. Scott's family heavily believed he was alive when he washed ashore, but reportedly the forensic tests couldn't conclusively say one way or the other. But as of now, we don't know the answer to this question. Question number 2. Who buried Scott Moorman? Was it his fellow crewmates? I'd say this is less likely, as there was no trace of the other men anywhere on the island, living or deceased. So, who put Scott in that shallow grave? Forum users speculate on the events that transpired the day of the storm in order to answer this question. Some suggest that Scott may have survived the initial storm and been at the merciless hands of the ocean, alone in the Sarah Jo. Others thought he might have tied himself to the boat to avoid drifting out to sea and died the day he disappeared. But the men's families weren't satisfied with speculation and hired Honolulu-based private detective Steve Goodnow to try and unravel the final fate of Patrick Woessner, Ralph Malaiakini, Peter Hanchett, Benjamin Kalama, and Scott Moorman. Utilizing weather data to calculate the trajectory of the Sarah Jo following the storm, the investigator found that the skiff was, quote, tantalizingly close to Cayleigh Island. So close, the men might have taken their chances and tried to swim to shore, only to drown in the ocean. The waters around the atoll were also searched, and the outboard engine from the Sarah Jo was found, but not much else. Goodnow theorized Scott was the last to perish, whether from dehydration or starvation, and the other men were buried at sea. While this theory doesn't account for the time discrepancy in the Sarajevo's expected course, again, any number of factors could have altered it or delayed it, especially if Scott was alive and trying to find help by redirecting the boat. Then investigator Goodnow came across an astonishing development. A Taiwanese fisherman reportedly stumbled across Scott Moorman's remains. He buried them, but didn't notify island authorities because he was illegally fishing in the area. This explains quite a bit, especially when looking at the mystery of the strange foil papers Scott was buried with. Various forum users on Unsolved Mysteries page have speculated it could have been everything from a rudimentary battery known as a voltaic pile to a makeshift receiving radio. Another user claims the tin foil might have been used as an attempt to communicate using a reflective surface. Considering the men didn't even have a radio on board with them, these theories are entirely possible, but maybe improbable, especially after digging into the next theory about the mysterious papers. Dan Nguyen on the Unsolved Mysteries page said that the papers being described were, quote, Buddhist tradition. You're supposed to burn it to help the spirit with passing. It's supposed to represent money. There were several other similar comments concerning the spiritual significance of these papers, and after a little more research, I came across the technical term for this spiritual money, joss paper. Now, the original description of these papers is, again, as follows. A sheaf of paper, a book, except not bound, probably about 3 inches by maybe 3/4 of an inch thick. Between each one of the pieces of paper was a very small square piece of foil material. When I saw the pictures of the joss paper, I thought it was highly likely this is what was buried with Scott Moorman's remains. According to Wikipedia, joss paper is also known as ghost money, sheets of paper and/or paper crafts made into burnt offerings which are common in various Asian religious practices, including the veneration of the deceased on holidays and special occasions. It is reported Scott's body was found with gold and silver foil, representative of money in the afterlife or good fortune to help assist the deceased into the afterlife. Personally, I find this theory fits more in line with the description of the papers and the theory that Scott was discovered and buried by a Taiwanese man fishing illegally in the Marshall Islands. The final mystery will likely never be answered. What happened to the other men? In this case, it seems like they either didn't survive the initial storm, or if they did, died along the Sarajevo's journey and were cast out to their final resting places at sea. Just a year after Scott Moorman's remains were unearthed, Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode dedicated to the disappearance of the Sarajevo. But concrete answers about what happened to Scott, Patrick, Ralph, Peter, and Benjamin still remain buried. However, the people of Hannah have hardly forgotten about the men. There were 2 memorials erected in their honor, one at the boat ramp at Hannah Bay, and the other where the Sarajevo was found 10 years later. The plaques read, "In loving memory of the crew of the Sarajevo, lost at sea, Hannah, Maui, February 11th, 1979. Hannah remembers her sons." The people of Maui continued to honor the tragic event and even held a luau to commemorate the 30th anniversary in February of 2009. While the community was undeniably impacted, the family members of the 5 men were undoubtedly hit the hardest. Ralph Malaiakini's brother kept the remains of the Sarajevo in his backyard as a tribute to the brother and friends he had lost that day. Ralph has his own theories as to what happened, believing Scott tied himself to the boat during the storm while the other men perished somewhere along the 2,000-mile journey to the Marshall Islands. But it seems the tragic fate of the other missing men will remain forever anchored to the ocean floor, and I only hope the families can find some closure in their own ways, even without answers. Thank you all for giving this case a moment of your time, and no matter what you believe or what you speculate, I only ask you for respect in the comments, and remember, though these may be dark matters, the darkness always matters. Thank you all for watching the video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any new videos from me. If you're looking for other similarly unsolved cases, you can click any of the videos on screen now. Stay safe, friends, and have a good night.